All right, so today we're gonna like really dive into, which governments around the world are actually like, best prepared for this whole like AI thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, totally. AI age, right? The future.
Depends who future is now.
And so we're looking at this index. It's called the Government AI Readiness Index for 2024.
Yeah, just came out.
Yeah, so it's brand new. And this, I think like the best way to understand, kind of quickly, like what's going on globally with this.
Absolutely. It's a great snapshot. And it's actually been running for quite a while now. This is the 7th edition of the index.
Oh, wow.
From Oxford Insights. So it's a well-established report.
They definitely have the cred.
Yeah, very much so.
To do this.
Yeah, and it's used by, everyone from like national governments themselves to, UNESCO, the UN's Education and Culture Organization. Even bodies like the G20 are looking to this to see, how countries are doing, how they stack up.
That's so interesting.
So this report came out in December 2024, and it covers a whopping 188 countries.
It's comprehensive.
Yeah, so pretty much everybody. And like at its heart is this really like crucial question, how ready are governments to actually use AI to, deliver public services effectively?
Not just talk about it.
Yeah.
Not just think about it, but actually put it into practice.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's become even more important, right? Because we see governments everywhere facing just this huge, this increasing complexity of problems, right? The needs of their citizens are changing constantly. We have economic uncertainty, climate change's impacts are becoming impossible to ignore, and then inequalities persist.
Big time.
So AI, it's not a silver bullet, but it offers a set of tools that could at least potentially help governments deal with these.
Yeah, I feel like the conversation has definitely matured. Like,
absolutely.
It used to be all about, how do we even regulate AI? How do we control this thing? And now it's like, okay, we need to figure out how to apply it to actually improve how governments function.
Absolutely, make things better for people on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. So this index really digs into that shift in focus, which I think is really important.
It does. And to do that, it uses this framework of 3 main pillars.
Okay.
And each pillar looks at different aspects of AI readiness.
Makes sense. So let's break it down.
Yeah, let's do it.
The first one is government.
Right.
So what does that tell us?
Well, this pillar is all about looking inward at the government itself.
Okay.
So it's about their strategic thinking, their internal capabilities. Do they even have a plan for AI? What are the rules? What are the ethical guidelines in place? What kind of digital capacity does the government already have? And how good are they at adapting and changing, innovating?
So basically, like, does the government itself, have its own act together?
Exactly. It's about whether the government is ready to walk the walk.
I like that. Okay, so for that first part, that vision aspect, actually having a plan for AI.
Right.
How do they measure that?
Well, the simplest way they look at that is, do you have a national AI strategy?
Oh, okay.
Like a written document.
So like 100 points if you've got a strategy, you've released it to the world.
100 points released, 50 points if you've got a draft or it's clear you're working on something, and 0 if there's no evidence at all.
So you can really see, like right off the bat, how serious a government is about this.
Yeah. If you've released a strategy, it shows you're thinking ahead.
Yeah, you're being proactive.
You're engaged.
Yeah.
And if there's nothing, it suggests you're kind of lagging behind.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, what about the next part? Governance and ethics. That seems super important.
Hugely important. This is all about responsible AI and making sure it's implemented in a trustworthy way.
Yeah.
So they look at the laws and regulations in place first. Things like data protection. How strong are your privacy laws?
Okay.
And again, they use that same scoring system. 100 points, you've got the laws. 50 points, they're in development. 0 if nothing's there.
All right, makes sense.
Then they look at cybersecurity.
Okay.
Using something called the Global Cybersecurity Index. And then they consider the overall quality of a country's regulations, which comes from something called the Worldwide Governance Indicators.
Okay.
This is a broader assessment of like how good a country's governance structures are.
Gotcha.
Then specifically for AI, they look at whether you've adopted ethical AI principles. Okay. And ideally, those principles should be aligned with what the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has laid out. And then lastly, they look at government accountability, which again draws from those worldwide governance indicators.
Okay, so it's a pretty good overview of like the legal and ethical foundations.
Yeah. Are you setting up the right guardrails, basically?
Gotcha. Okay, what's the next piece of the government pillar?
So that's digital capacity.
Okay.
This is really about the government's practical ability to actually work with AI.
So like, can their systems even handle it?
Exactly. Do they have the infrastructure, the skills? So they look at a few indicators here. How much are online services available to citizens?
Okay.
That data comes from the UN e-government survey.
Okay.
Then what's their basic IT infrastructure like?
Right.
They get that from something called the GovTech Maturity Index.
Got it.
Then they look at how much the government itself is actively supporting AI adoption.
Okay.
And that's from the World Economic Forum Executive Opinion Survey.
Interesting.
And then new this year, they're also looking at how well a country is developing AI skills within the public sector.
Oh, wow.
And that comes from the Global Index on Responsible AI.
That's really interesting.
So it's getting pretty specific.
Yeah. Okay. So that's digital capacity makes sense.
Yeah.
And then the final part of this government pillar is adaptability.
Right.
So what are we talking about there?
So this is about how inherently adaptable is the government.
Okay.
Can they change? Can they brace new ideas?
Yeah.
And the indicators here look at first government effectiveness,
Okay.
which comes from those worldwide governance indicators again.
Uh-huh.
Then how responsive is the government to change?
Right.
And that's from the World Economic Forum Executive Opinion Survey again.
Okay.
And then they even look at the availability of data on government procurement,
Interesting. Okay.
which comes from the Global Data Barometer.
So that's a pretty thorough look at the government pillar.
I think so.
The second pillar is technology sector.
Mm-hmm.
What's this one all about?
So we're shifting our focus outward now.
Okay.
So it's not about the government itself, but about the country's tech industry.
Okay.
How mature is it? How innovative is it? And can it actually provide the AI tools that the government needs?
Mm-hmm.
But also, do they have the skilled workforce to actually build these solutions?
So basically, does a country have the right kind of companies and people?
Exactly. Can they actually put AI into practice?
Interesting. Okay, so how do they measure the maturity of the tech sector? Like, how do we know if a country's got what it takes to supply AI?
So they look at a few things here.
Okay.
One is the number of AI unicorns.
Unicorns meaning like,
Startup companies valued at over $1 billion
wow. Okay.
that are focused on AI.
Got it.
But they also look at non-AI tech unicorns just to get a sense of the overall tech landscape.
Okay.
And that data comes from CB Insights.
Uh-huh.
Then they look at how much trade is happening in ICT services and goods.
ICT meaning?
Information and communication technology.
Right.
And that's measured per person
Okay.
to make it fair. And that comes from UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development.
Got it.
And then lastly, they look at how much money a country is spending on computer software,
Makes sense.
which comes from the Global Innovation Index.
Yeah.
Now, it's worth noting that they actually do some statistical adjustments to these unicorn numbers.
Oh, really? Why is that?
It's probably to even out any extreme outliers.
Okay.
Yeah, some countries might have a couple of huge unicorns that skew the picture.
That makes sense.
So smooth that out to get a more representative view.
Got it. Okay, so that's maturity. What about the second part of the technology sector pillar, innovation capacity?
Right. So this is all about, are the conditions right for innovation to thrive in the tech sector?
Okay.
So they look at things like, how much time do businesses spend dealing with government regulations?
Oh, interesting.
And here, a lower score is actually better.
Right. Less bureaucracy.
Less red tape, exactly.
Okay.
And then they look at venture capital.
Uh-huh.
How easy is it for startups to get funding?
Right.
And they use data from Deal Room for that. And they consider both the total amount of venture capital available and how that compares to the country's GDP.
Okay, so it's relative to the size of the economy.
Yeah, exactly. Then they look at R&D spending, research and development.
Uh-huh.
That comes from UNESCO.
Got it.
And then they look at how much AI is actually being used for innovation itself.
Oh, wow.
So are companies actually embracing AI to innovate?
That's really meta.
Yeah, a little bit, right?
Cool.
That's from the World Economic Forum Executive Opinion Survey. And then they also look at the number of AI research papers being published from Samago. And again, they statistically treat these numbers for R&D and AI papers just like they did with the unicorns.
Right, to smooth things out.
Exactly. Okay, so that's a lot of different angles.
Yeah, for sure. The final part of the technology sector pillar is human capital.
Right.
So what skills are we talking about here?
So this is all about the skills in the population that are needed to actually support a strong tech sector.
Okay.
So, can you actually find the people to do the jobs?
Right. Right.
So they look at things like the number of graduates in STEM fields.
STEM meaning?
Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Gotcha.
And that data comes from UNESCO. Then they look at the number of GitHub users per 1,000 people.
GitHub being like?
A platform for software developers to collaborate and share code.
Got it.
That data comes from the GitHub Innovation Graph. And then they look at specifically female STEM graduates.
Oh, interesting.
Again, from UNESCO. But here they actually set a maximum at 50 to reflect gender parity.
So if you're above 50, it doesn't help your score.
Yeah, it's more about balance.
Right.
Then they look at the quality of higher education in engineering and technology using the QS rankings. And then finally, they look at overall ICT skills, which comes from the Network Readiness Index.
Wow. So we've covered government, we've covered technology sector.
We have.
The third and final pillar is data and infrastructure.
Yep.
So what's the focus here?
This is about the fundamental building blocks that AI needs to function.
Okay.
So on one hand, it's about data. Is there enough data available? Is it good quality data to train AI models?
Right.
And then the other part is the infrastructure.
The tech behind it.
Exactly. Like, does the country have the technological backbone to support AI?
So let's start with infrastructure.
Okay.
What indicators are they using to see how strong a country's tech backbone is?
So first, they look at telecommunications infrastructure using an index from the UN eGov program.
Got it.
Then they look at the number of supercomputers a country has. And that comes from the top 500 list. And they do some statistical adjustments to this data as well.
Right.
Then they look at broadband quality.
Makes sense.
Which comes from the EIU Inclusive Internet Index.
The EIU being?
The Economist Intelligence Unit.
Oh, okay.
Then they look at 5G infrastructure. How widespread is it?
Right.
And that comes from the GSMA Mobile Connectivity Index.
GSMA being?
The GSMA is a global association for mobile operators.
Okay.
And then lastly, they look at the adoption of other key technologies like AI, big data, VR, and AR.
All those fun things.
Exactly. That's from the World Economic Forum Executive Opinion Survey.
Okay, so that's infrastructure. What about data availability?
Right. So this is all about how much data is actually out there that could potentially be used to train AI models.
Okay.
So one indicator is how open is government data. That comes from the Global Data Barometer.
Okay.
Then they look at data governance practices.
Makes sense.
Which is based on research informed by the GovTech Maturity Index. Then they look at mobile phone subscriptions.
Okay.
How many are there per person?
Right.
Which comes from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union.
Okay.
And they actually set a maximum at 130 subscriptions per 100 people.
Oh, interesting.
So once you hit that point, having even more doesn't really help your score.
Yeah, like there's probably diminishing returns at that point.
Exactly.
Okay.
Then they look at the percentage of households with internet access, also from the ITU. And finally, they look at the overall statistical capacity of a country.
Statistical capacity meaning like?
Can they produce and analyze statistics effectively?
Okay.
And that comes from the SPI GitHub report.
So that's data availability. The final part of this pillar is data representativeness.
Right.
Why is it so important that the data reflects the whole population?
Because if the data used to train AI models isn't representative, then those models can be biased or just inaccurate.
Oh, yeah.
Because they've only been trained on data from a specific group of people.
That makes sense.
So this is all about how likely is it that the data out there actually represents everyone?
Got it.
So they look at the gender gap in internet access.
Okay.
That comes from the GSMA Mobile Connectivity Index. And here, a smaller gap is better.
Right. So the more equal access, the better.
Exactly. And then they look at how affordable mobile devices are.
Okay.
Which comes from the EIU Inclusive Internet Index.
So that's a really comprehensive assessment across these three pillars.
Yeah, they really cover a lot of ground.
So what are some of the big takeaways from this 2024 index?
Well, a few key trends stand out.
Okay.
First, the U.S. is still on top.
Like they're #1 in AI readiness?
Yep. They continue to hold the lead, but there's a nuance to that.
Okay. What is it?
Their advantage is mostly because of their technology sector.
Right. They
actually rank behind Singapore in both the government and data and infrastructure pillars.
Oh, wow. So it's not a clean sweep.
Not at all. The U.S. just has this much bigger, more mature tech market compared to other countries at the top. So they have a huge advantage in that specific area. But their lead in the other two pillars is actually pretty small.
That's a good point to keep in mind. So it's not like the U.S. is dominating in every way.
Exactly. It's more nuanced than that.
What's another interesting finding?
So a really positive trend is that a lot of middle-income economies are making some really impressive progress.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, they're starting to close the gap in AI readiness.
Awesome.
Countries like Ukraine, Costa Rica, Moldova, and Uzbekistan are all doing really well.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, and what's interesting is they seem to have this common approach.
Okay, what is it?
They're really focused on building strong foundational governance for AI.
What exactly do you mean by foundational governance?
So it's about getting the basics right.
Okay.
Things like developing a clear national AI strategy, adopting ethical principles for AI, and making sure their data is well managed.
So it's about setting up the right framework.
Exactly. And it seems to be paying off because these countries are now performing above the global average.
That's great.
In key areas like having a vision for AI, setting up good governance and ethics frameworks, and ensuring data availability.
So they might not have the massive tech sector of some wealthier nations,
Yeah,
but they're making up for it by getting those fundamental elements in place.
exactly. And in fact, all four of those countries, I mentioned Ukraine, Costa Rica, Moldova, and Uzbekistan,
Yeah.
they all got a perfect score of 100 in the vision dimension,
Wow.
which means they have officially released national AI strategies.
So they're not messing around.
They're taking it seriously.
Yeah.
And they've also made good progress on setting ethical guidelines and improving their open data policies.
That's really encouraging to hear. What's the third big takeaway?
Well, the report also highlights the increasing importance of global collaboration
Okay.
when it comes to AI governance.
Right, because this isn't something any one country can tackle on their own.
Exactly. AI technology is advancing so rapidly that international cooperation is becoming essential.
Yeah, to make sure it's developed and used responsibly.
Exactly. We need to work together to set shared frameworks, international standards, and really encourage collaborative efforts.
Makes sense. So what are some concrete examples of this global collaboration?
Well, one prime example is the Council of Europe's AI Treaty.
Okay.
This is actually the first legally binding international agreement on AI.
Wow, that's a big deal.
It is, and it's focused on making sure that AI upholds human rights, democracy, and the rule of law.
So those core values are protected.
Exactly. Then we have the International Network of AI Safety Institutes,
Okay.
which was launched at the AI Seoul Summit in 2024. And this brings together countries like the U.S., Japan, and France to specifically advance research on AI safety.
Interesting.
And of course, UNESCO is still doing really important work
Yeah, we mentioned them earlier.
with their readiness assessment methodology, which has now been used by 58 governments
Wow.
around the world to make sure their AI efforts are aligned with UNESCO's ethical recommendations.
So a lot of different players working on this global governance piece.
Absolutely.
What about at a regional level? What are we seeing there?
So there's a lot of regional activity as well.
Okay.
In Latin America, for example, they have the Montevideo Declaration, which builds on an earlier agreement called the Santiago Declaration.
Okay.
And this really strengthens regional cooperation on AI governance.
Interesting.
And it lays out a specific 2-year roadmap for AI ethics.
Oh, wow. So they're getting really concrete.
Yeah, they're moving from principles to action. And then the African Union has put forward its Continental AI Strategy, which is all about harmonizing AI policies across Africa
Okay.
and encouraging ethical AI development and deployment.
So kind of like a unified approach for the whole continent.
Exactly. And then we also have ISESCO, the Islamic World Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization.
Okay.
They're also actively working to improve AI readiness among their member states.
So there's a lot going on at both the global and regional levels.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of momentum.
It seems like people are realizing that this is something we need to work on together.
Absolutely. All right, so let's look at the rankings themselves.
Okay. Yeah, let's dive into that.
So North America comes out on top as a region,
Right.
with the highest average score of 82.60.
Okay.
Both the U.S. with a score of 87.03 and Canada at 78.18 rank in the global top 10.
Makes sense.
And both countries are performing above the global average across all 3 pillars.
So they're doing well across the board.
Yeah, pretty consistently.
Okay. What about Western Europe?
So they're close behind
Right.
with an average score of 69.56. And they also have a really strong presence in the global top 10.
Yeah, like who are we talking about?
Countries like France, the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, Finland.
All the usual suspects.
Yeah, pretty much. And they're particularly strong in the data and infrastructure pillar.
Oh, Interesting.
They're well above the global average in that area.
Okay, cool. What about East Asia? How are they doing?
So East Asia ranks third regionally
Okay.
with an average of 57.95.
Uh-huh.
And Singapore and South Korea are both right up there at the top.
Yeah.
Singapore has a score of 84.25.
Wow.
And South Korea is at 79.98.
So they're both in the top 3 globally.
They are.
That's impressive.
Yeah, their strength is really in the government pillar.
Okay.
Although their technology sector is a bit less advanced compared to some other top performers.
Interesting.
And the report does mention that there are some data limitations when it comes to China.
Okay.
So it's hard to get a completely accurate assessment of their ranking.
Makes sense. What about Eastern Europe?
So Eastern Europe comes in fourth regionally
Okay.
with an average score of 57.88.
Uh-huh.
And Estonia is the leader there with a score of 72.62.
Okay.
And they're the only Eastern European country in the global top 25.
Interesting.
They're doing really well in the data and infrastructure and government pillars,
But
but their technology sector is lagging a bit behind.
gotcha. Okay, how about the Middle East and North Africa?
So the MENA region has an average score of 48.50, which puts them right in the middle of the regional rankings.
Mm-hmm.
The UAE, Israel, and Saudi Arabia are leading the pack there.
Okay.
They all have scores above 72.
Interesting.
And what's kind of unique about this region is they have the widest range of scores in the entire index.
Oh, wow. So some countries are doing really well and others are.
Yeah, there's a big spread.
Okay.
But overall, they're doing a little bit better than average in the technology sector and data and infrastructure pillars.
Right.
But they have room for improvement in the government pillar.
Got it. And then lastly, what about the other regions like Latin America and the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, those areas?
Right. So Latin America and the Caribbean has an average of 42.99.
Okay.
And Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay are the leaders there.
Mm-hmm.
Their biggest challenge is really their technology sector.
Okay.
South and Central Asia average 42.28.
Uh-huh.
India's at the top of that region,
Okay.
followed by Turkey and Uzbekistan.
Got it.
And for them, data and infrastructure is a key area where they need to improve. The Pacific region averages 44.92,
Uh-huh.
and Australia and New Zealand are the clear leaders there.
No surprise there.
Not really.
Okay.
And then Sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest regional average
Okay.
at 32.70.
Uh-huh.
Mauritius, South Africa, and Rwanda are showing the most progress.
Okay.
They're doing the best in the data and infrastructure pillar,
Uh-huh.
but they really need to invest in both the government and technology sector pillars.
Okay, so it's a really fascinating picture of where different regions stand.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, this report is so comprehensive and it brings up so many questions.
Definitely.
So what are some of the key questions that you think we should be thinking about based on all of this?
Well, for starters,
Yeah.
we talk about how the U.S. is leading,
Uh-huh.
but it's really because of their technology sector.
Right.
So what are those specific aspects of their tech sector that give them such a big advantage?
Yeah.
And is that advantage going to last?
Right, because technology changes so fast.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
What else?
And then, Singapore is doing really well in the government and data and infrastructure pillars.
Yeah.
So what can other high-income countries learn from them?
Yeah, what are they doing? Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then we saw how some middle-income countries are making a lot of progress
Right.
by focusing on foundational governance.
Yeah.
So how can they build on those strengths to really accelerate their AI readiness?
Okay. Those are some great questions. What else should we be thinking about?
Well, a lot of countries are developing national AI strategies,
Right.
but how do we actually translate those strategies into real improvements?
Yeah, it's one thing to have a plan. It's another to actually put it into action.
Exactly. And then we talked about those international agreements like the Council of Europe's AI treaty.
Mm-hmm.
So how much will those agreements actually influence what countries do?
Right. Are they going to have teeth?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then all these regional collaborations,
Mm.
like what are the best ways for regions to work together to really advance AI governance and readiness?
That's a good one.
Okay.
Okay. Any other big questions that come to mind?
Well, we also saw how some regions consistently underperform in certain areas.
Right.
So why is that?
Yeah.
What are the underlying factors there?
Mm-hmm.
And what kind of targeted interventions could help address those weaknesses?
Okay.
And then at the end of the day, governments are doing all of this to try to improve people's lives.
Right.
So how do we make sure that progress in AI readiness actually translates into tangible benefits for citizens?
Yeah. How do we make sure it's not just about the tech, but about the people?
Exactly.
And then thinking even more broadly, this index measures specific things, but there are other factors that it doesn't capture, like cultural norms or political stability. So how do those things influence a country's ability to really adopt AI?
That's a big question.
Yeah. And then finally, AI technology is constantly evolving.
At an incredible pace.
So how do we need to adapt the very definition and measurement of AI readiness to keep up with those changes?
Yeah, because what's considered AI ready today might be totally different in a few years.
Exactly. So to wrap things up, what are the essential takeaways from this deep dive into the Government AI Readiness Index?
Well, I think it gives us a really clear picture of the global landscape.
Okay.
The U.S. is in the lead, but their strength is really concentrated in that tech sector.
Right.
And then we're seeing some really encouraging progress from middle-income countries that are focusing on getting those governance foundations, right?
Yeah.
And globally, we're seeing this push towards greater collaboration and governance.
Which is really important.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, being ready for AI requires balance.
Okay.
You need to develop all three of those pillars: government technology sector and data and infrastructure.
So it's not just about having the fanciest tech?
Not at all. It's much broader than that.
Yeah, it's about the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. And I think this index really underscores that while some countries might have a head start, a focused strategy and strong international partnerships can help others catch up.
Yeah, and really harness the power of AI.
Exactly.
This has been a really insightful look at the 2024 Government AI Readiness Index.
Been a pleasure.
So for you listening out there, we encourage you to think about where your own country ranks in this index.
Yeah.
Or maybe a country that you're really interested in. And what do those rankings tell you about that country's future? Are they going to be a leader in this AI-driven world?
Or are they going to fall behind?
And you can also explore the full report from Oxford Insights. If you want to dig deeper into the country-specific analysis.
There's a ton of great information in there.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
For more videos, don't forget to subscribe and like the videos.